In the winter of 1850, a 23-year-old woman named Sarah Collins disappeared from the Whitmore plantation in Natchez, Mississippi. No record of her sale exists. No bill of transfer. No obituary. No grave marker. For 173 years, historians assumed she had escaped north, perhaps through the Underground Railroad, perhaps drowned in the attempt. But in 2023, a collection of letters was discovered in the attic of a Charleston estate sale. Letters that had been sealed, hidden, and deliberately forgotten. Letters written in 3 different hands. Letters that revealed Sarah Collins never left the Whitmore plantation at all. What happened to her in those final months challenges everything we think we understand about power, possession, and the human capacity for obsession. This is her story. Or rather, this is the story of what was done to her. The letters were purchased by Dr. Evelyn Hart, a professor of American history at Tulane University, for $47. She didn't know what she had. Not at first. It took her 6 months to authenticate them. Another year to piece together the timeline. And when she finally understood what she was reading, she told me she couldn't sleep for 3 weeks. Because these weren't just historical documents. They were confessions. They were evidence. They were the kind of truth that most people spend their entire lives trying to bury. The first letter was written by Margaret Whitmore, wife of plantation owner Richard Whitmore, dated March 14, 1850. It was addressed to her sister in Virginia. It was never sent. In it, Margaret describes a girl she calls the most remarkable creature I have ever encountered. She writes about Sarah's intelligence, her ability to read despite it being illegal, her knowledge of medicinal herbs, her quiet defiance. But then the letter shifts. Margaret writes, "I find myself thinking of her at all hours. I watch her hands as she works. I have begun requesting her presence in my chambers for reasons I cannot fully explain to myself, let alone to you, dear sister. Richard has noticed my attention. God help me, he shares it." The second letter was written by Richard Whitmore himself, dated April 2, 1850. It was addressed to his brother, a lawyer in New Orleans. It was also never sent. In it, Richard describes what he calls an arrangement with his wife. An arrangement concerning Sarah Collins. He writes about jealousy, about negotiations between husband and wife, about schedules and territories and rules. He writes about Sarah as though she were a shared resource to be managed. He never once writes about her as a human being with her own will. But then, at the end of the letter, he includes one sentence that suggests he understood exactly what he was doing. He writes, "I know this cannot end well. I know there will be a reckoning. But I find I cannot stop myself, and neither can Margaret." The third set of documents is the most troubling. Tucked inside the letters was a journal. 23 pages, handwritten in careful script, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. The handwriting matches samples we have of Sarah Collins writing from a ledger book where she had been taught to record household expenses. This journal was written by Sarah herself. It spans the months from January to November of 1850. And it describes, in unflinching detail, what it was like to be caught between two people who claimed to love her but who owned her completely. People who competed for her. People who made promises they could never keep. People who slowly, methodically, destroyed any chance she had of survival. Natchez, Mississippi, 1850. By all historical accounts, it was one of the wealthiest cities in America. More millionaires per capita than New York City. That wealth came from one source, cotton. And that cotton came from the labor of over 30,000 enslaved people living within a 20-mile radius. The Whitmore plantation, Cedar Grove, was considered a model estate. 2,000 acres. 147 enslaved people. A main house with 16 rooms, imported wallpaper from France, a library with over 500 books. Richard Whitmore was 38 years old, educated at Harvard, well regarded in Natchez society. His wife, Margaret, was 29, from a prominent Virginia family, known for her charity work and her interest in literature and music. When you read the newspapers from that time, the social columns, the letters between families, the Whitmores are mentioned frequently. They hosted parties. They were pillars of the community. Margaret was admired for what was called her gentle management of household staff. Richard was respected for his business acumen. From the outside, they appeared to be the ideal Southern couple. Refined. Prosperous. Moral, by the standards of their time and place. But prosperity in the antebellum South was built on a foundation of absolute control. Control over land, over labor, over human bodies. The legal code was explicit: enslaved people were property, not persons. They could be bought, sold, traded, inherited, and used in any way their owners deemed fit. There was no legal recourse. No appeal. No protection. The law itself was designed to ensure complete dominion. What people today often don't fully grasp is the totality of that power. An enslaved person had no legal standing to refuse anything. Not labor. Not punishment. Not sexual advances. The master and mistress had legal immunity for virtually any action short of murder, and even murder was rarely prosecuted if the victim was enslaved. So when we talk about what happened to Sarah Collins, we have to understand that everything done to her was, technically, legal under the laws of Mississippi in 1850. That's the horror of it. The system itself authorized this kind of exploitation. Sarah Collins was born in 1827 on a smaller plantation in Georgia. Records show she was sold twice before the age of 15. In 1845, she was purchased by Richard Whitmore for $800. She was 18 years old. The bill of sale describes her as healthy, intelligent, skilled in household management and nursing. But there's another notation in Richard's personal ledger, discovered among the letters. Next to Sarah's name, he had written, "Exceptional. Handle with care." What did he mean by that? Historians believe Richard had recognized something in Sarah from the beginning. Something that made her different from the other people he enslaved. Not her skills, though she had many. Not her appearance, though descriptions suggest she was striking. But her mind. Her self-possession. Multiple accounts from other enslaved people who knew her described Sarah as someone who held herself apart, who watched everything, who seemed to be calculating something beyond the immediate moment. In Sarah's journal, there's an entry from January 1850, before things escalated. She writes, "They watch me like I am a puzzle they want to solve. Mistress asks me questions about what I think, what I feel, as if my thoughts belong to her just as much as my hands do. Master listens at doors when I speak to the other girls. They don't know that I watch them back. They don't know that I see how they look at each other when they talk about me. They think I am grateful for their attention. They think I am fortunate." That last line. They think I am fortunate. Sarah understood exactly what was happening. She had a clarity about her situation that's remarkable given how young she was. But clarity doesn't mean power. She could see the trap. She just couldn't escape it. The Whitmore household operated on a strict schedule. Sarah's duties included attending to Margaret in the morning, helping her dress, arranging her hair, bringing her breakfast. She worked in the main house from dawn until well past dark. She slept in a small room off the kitchen, separate from the other enslaved people who lived in the quarters. That separation was deliberate. Margaret had insisted on it, claiming Sarah's skills made her too valuable to house with the field workers. But that isolation also meant Sarah had no witnesses to what happened behind closed doors. No one to confirm her account. No one to protect her. In February of 1850, something shifted. Margaret began requesting Sarah's presence more frequently. Not for work, but for conversation. She asked Sarah to read to her. To sit with her during meals. To help her with correspondence. Margaret gave Sarah a dress that had belonged to her, altered to fit. She gave her a hairbrush with a silver handle. Small gifts, but significant in a world where enslaved people owned nothing, not even the clothes on their backs. What Margaret was doing is a classic pattern of grooming. She was creating a sense of special relationship, of privilege, of mutual affection. She was blurring the lines between mistress and servant, between owner and owned. But those lines can never truly be blurred when one person has absolute power over another. Margaret could give gifts, but she could also take everything away, including Sarah's life. That power imbalance means that nothing Sarah did in response to Margaret's attention could be considered consensual. She was responding to coercion, even if that coercion was wrapped in kindness. Margaret wrote in her letter to her sister, "I believe Sarah cares for me. I see it in her eyes when we speak. She smiles when I enter the room. She has confided in me about her mother, who was sold away when Sarah was 7. She weeps in my presence. Surely that means she trusts me. Surely that means we have formed a genuine bond." But Sarah's journal tells a different story. From March 1850, "Mistress believes my smiles. She doesn't understand that I learned to smile before I learned to speak. She thinks my tears are for her, that I cry because she is kind and it moves me. She doesn't know I cry because I understand where this is leading, and I have no way to stop it. She owns my body, and now she wants my gratitude for taking more of it." On March 28, 1850, Richard Whitmore walked into his wife's sitting room unannounced. Margaret was having her hair brushed by Sarah. According to Margaret's letter, Richard stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching them. Then he said, "I see that I am not the only one who finds her company agreeable." Margaret wrote that she felt her face flush. She felt caught, exposed, though she insisted she had done nothing wrong. Richard crossed the room, stood behind Sarah, and placed his hand on her shoulder. Margaret wrote, "I felt a surge of something I can barely name. Jealousy, yes. But also something else. A shared recognition." Richard looked at me, and I looked at him, and Sarah stood perfectly still between us, and I realized that we were both thinking the same thought. I realized that my husband and I wanted the same thing, and that thing was standing within arm's reach of both of us. This is the moment. This is when the dynamic shifts from individual obsession to shared conspiracy. Up until now, Margaret and Richard had been circling Sarah separately. But in that moment, they recognized each other's desire, and instead of it creating conflict between them, it created alliance. They became collaborators in their pursuit of Sarah. And that made Sarah's position infinitely more dangerous, because now she wasn't just dealing with one person's fixation. She was dealing with two people who were reinforcing each other's worst impulses. That evening, Richard and Margaret had what Margaret called a frank discussion. No record exists of exactly what was said, but the outcome was clear. They reached an understanding. An arrangement. Richard wrote in his letter to his brother, "Margaret and I have come to terms. We will share her time, her attention, her presence. I will have certain hours. Margaret will have others. We have agreed to rules. We have agreed to discretion. We have agreed that Sarah will be treated well, better than the others, as long as she complies with what we ask of her. Margaret believes this is generous. I want to believe she is right." Sarah's journal entry from March 30th is 3 sentences long. "They spoke to me together tonight. They told me I was special. They told me what they expected. We have to be clear about what this means. This wasn't a relationship. This wasn't a consensual arrangement between adults. This was two people with absolute legal power over a third person deciding how they would use that person's body. Sarah had no ability to refuse. If she resisted, she could be beaten, sold, killed. The law would not protect her. No one would protect her. She was completely isolated, completely vulnerable, and now she was being claimed by both her master and her mistress simultaneously. Over the next 2 weeks, the arrangement began in earnest. Sarah's schedule was restructured. She now spent her mornings with Margaret and her evenings with Richard. The middle of the day she worked under the supervision of the head housekeeper, an older enslaved woman named Ruth, who noticed the change but said nothing. In the world of the plantation, silence was survival. Ruth kept a record. Nothing formal. Just notes she hid in her cabin. Her family preserved them. There's an entry from April of 1850 where she writes, "The girl Sarah is being taken from us piece by piece. She doesn't speak anymore when she works. She moves like a ghost." I tried to ask her if she was all right, but she looked at me with empty eyes and said, "What does all right mean?" I didn't have an answer. Margaret wrote to her sister, "Sarah has adjusted beautifully to the new arrangement. She seems content. She performs her duties with grace. Richard and I find that our marriage has actually improved. We have a shared interest, a shared affection. It has brought us closer together. I believe Sarah senses this and is pleased to be the source of our renewed happiness." But Richard's letter to his brother tells a different story. He wrote, "Margaret doesn't see what I see. Sarah complies, yes. She does everything asked of her. But there's a coldness in her now. A distance. When I speak to her, she looks through me rather than at me. I told Margaret we should be more gentle, more patient. Margaret laughed and said I was being sentimental. She said Sarah would grow to love us if we were consistent. But I don't think Sarah is capable of loving us. I think we've taken something from her that can't be given back. And yet, I can't stop. Neither can Margaret. We've started something neither of us knows how to finish." Sarah's journal entry from April 15, 1850, "I have learned to separate my mind from my body. When mistress touches my hair and speaks to me about love, I am somewhere else. When master calls me to his study and closes the door, I am somewhere else. They ask me if I care for them. They ask me if I am happy. I have learned to say yes. I have learned that yes is the only word that keeps me breathing. But every yes takes something from me. Every yes is a piece of myself I will never get back. They don't notice. They think I am becoming theirs. They don't realize I am becoming nothing at all." By May of 1850, the arrangement had become routine. The other enslaved people on the plantation had noticed Sarah's changed status but understood the danger of speaking about it. Silence protected everyone. But silence also meant Sarah was entirely alone in her experience. She had no one to confide in, no one to validate what was being done to her, no one to help her make sense of the psychological destruction she was enduring. Margaret and Richard had successfully isolated her not just physically but emotionally and socially. She existed in a prison of their making, and they congratulated themselves on how well she had adapted to her cage. In mid-May, Margaret threw a party. 20 guests from prominent Natchez families. Sarah was instructed to serve, to pour wine, to circulate among the guests with trays of food. Margaret introduced her to several ladies as her most trusted companion. She put her hand on Sarah's arm as she spoke, a gesture of ownership disguised as affection. One of the guests, a woman named Caroline Henderson, later wrote in her diary about the evening. She noted that Sarah was striking, that she moved with unusual grace, and that there was something unsettling about the way both Richard and Margaret watched her throughout the evening. She wrote, "It was as if they were both possessive of her in a way that seemed improper, even accounting for the relationship between master and slave. I mentioned it to my husband, who told me not to speculate about the private affairs of respectable people." That night, after the guests had left, Margaret called Sarah to her bedroom. Richard was already there, sitting in a chair by the window. According to Sarah's journal, Margaret told her that she had performed beautifully that evening, that she had made them proud. Then Margaret asked Sarah a question. She asked if Sarah understood how fortunate she was to be cared for by two people instead of just one. She asked if Sarah felt loved. Sarah wrote, "I said yes. What else could I say?" But as I said it, I watched Master's face, and I saw something there I hadn't seen before. Shame. For just a moment, he looked ashamed. Then he looked away, and the moment passed, and I understood that his shame would never be enough to stop him. Shame without action is just another form of cruelty. By June, cracks were beginning to form in the arrangement. Margaret and Richard had begun competing for Sarah's time in ways that went beyond their agreed-upon schedule. Margaret would keep Sarah longer in the mornings, making her late for her other duties. Richard would summon her in the middle of the day, disrupting the household routine. They began giving her contradictory instructions, each one trying to prove that Sarah preferred their company to the others. Sarah's journal from June 12, "They are fighting over me now. Not openly. They would never admit it. But I hear them at night, their voices rising and falling through the walls. Mistress accuses Master of monopolizing my time. Master tells Mistress she is becoming irrational. They both ask me who I would choose if I had the choice. I tell them I cannot choose. I tell them I am grateful to both. But the truth is, I would choose neither. I would choose to never have been born into a world where people can own other people." The psychological toll on Sarah was becoming visible. Ruth's notes from this period describe Sarah as withdrawn, barely eating, moving through her duties mechanically. Other enslaved people tried to offer her support, but Sarah rebuffed them. In her journal, she explained why. She wrote, "I cannot accept kindness from the others. If I do, I will break. I must stay frozen inside or I will shatter completely. They don't understand that their concern is dangerous to me. If I remember that I am human, I won't survive what is being done to me. So I must forget. I must become the thing they think I am. A possession. An object. Something without feelings or will. It is the only way through." In early July, something happened that would fundamentally change the dynamic. Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She didn't know whether the father was Richard or someone else entirely. In the months before the arrangement had begun, there had been an overseer named Thomas Green who had assaulted her. She had never told anyone. There was no point. The assault of enslaved women was so common it barely merited mention. But now, carrying a child, she faced an impossible calculation. Whose child was this? And what would happen when Margaret and Richard found out? Sarah's journal entry from July 8, "I am with child. I don't know how to feel about this. I don't know if I want this child or if I will come to love it or if I will resent it for tying me even more completely to this place. What I do know is that Mistress and Master will both claim this child as theirs. They will fight over it the way they fight over me. And if the child is born looking like the overseer rather than like Master, they will know I have been with someone else, and I don't know what they will do to me then. I am trapped in every direction. There is no path forward that doesn't lead to more suffering." When Sarah told Margaret about the pregnancy, Margaret's reaction was immediate and intense. She wept. She embraced Sarah. She told her that this was a blessing, that they would raise the child together, that Sarah would be cared for in ways she had never been cared for before. She promised Sarah that no harm would come to her or the child. She promised that this baby would be proof of their bond, of their special relationship. Then she told Richard. Richard's reaction was more complicated. In his letter to his brother, he wrote, "Margaret is convinced the child is mine. She speaks of it as though it were a legitimate grandchild, something to be celebrated. I am not as certain. There are other men on this plantation. Sarah has opportunities one am not always aware of. But I cannot voice these doubts to Margaret without revealing my own jealousy, my own possessiveness. So I say nothing. I smile. I agree that this is wonderful news. But inside, I am calculating. Watching. Waiting to see what the child looks like when it is born. And I am ashamed of myself for caring. The pregnancy changed everything. Margaret became even more protective of Sarah, insisting she rest more, eat better food, avoid heavy labor. She moved Sarah into a larger room, closer to the main family quarters. She brought in a doctor to examine her, something rarely done for enslaved women. The other enslaved people on the plantation watched these developments with a mixture of confusion and concern. They understood that Sarah's status had elevated again, but they also understood that elevation in the context of slavery was often a precursor to a terrible fall. Richard, meanwhile, became more distant. He stopped calling for Sarah in the evenings. He avoided being alone with her. In his letters, he described feeling trapped by the situation, unable to extricate himself without destroying his marriage and his reputation. He wrote, "I thought I could control this. I thought Margaret and I could manage this arrangement with discretion and care. But we were fools. We have created something that cannot be contained. A child will be born who may or may not be mine. Margaret is planning to keep the child close, to raise it in the house, to blur the lines between slave and family even further. I see disaster approaching, but I am powerless to stop it. Or perhaps I am simply unwilling to pay the price that stopping it would require." By August, Sarah was visibly pregnant. Her body was changing in ways she couldn't hide. The other enslaved women began helping her more, taking on tasks she could no longer easily perform. Ruth, in particular, became protective, bringing her food, checking on her in the night. Ruth's notes from August described Sarah as increasingly fragile, both physically and mentally. She wrote, "The girl is breaking. I see it in her eyes. She speaks to the baby sometimes when she thinks no one is listening. She tells it she is sorry. She tells it that she doesn't know how to protect it. She tells it that she wishes it had never been conceived. It breaks my heart to hear her. This child will be born into horror, and Sarah knows it." Margaret's obsession with the pregnancy became all-consuming. She spent hours with Sarah, talking about names, about what the child would be taught, about the future they would share. She began referring to herself as the child's mother, relegating Sarah to the role of caretaker. In one particularly disturbing letter to her sister, Margaret wrote, "I feel as though I am the one carrying this child. I feel its movements in my own body. Sarah is merely the vessel, the means by which Richard and I will finally have the child we have always wanted. God has given us this gift through her, and I am grateful. I know this arrangement is unconventional, but I believe it is right. I believe Sarah understands how blessed she is to be part of this." Sarah's understanding was very different. In her journal from September, she wrote, "Mistress has taken my child before it is even born. She has decided it belongs to her. Master doesn't argue with her, which means he agrees or he is too cowardly to object. They talk about the baby's future as if I will have no say in it. They talk about how the child will be raised in the house, educated, given opportunities. They don't seem to understand that any child I give birth to is enslaved. That no matter how much they dress it up, no matter how much they pretend, this child will be property. Their property. And someday, when they tire of their game, when the child grows up and becomes inconvenient, they will sell it or send it away, and I will have no power to stop them. This is the cruelest thing they have done yet. They have made me hope that maybe, somehow, my child could have a different life. And that hope is more dangerous than anything else." In late September, an event occurred that would shatter the fragile stability of the arrangement. Thomas Green, the overseer, got drunk at a tavern in Natchez and began talking. He told several men that Sarah Collins was carrying his child, not Richard Whitmore's. He claimed he had been with her multiple times, that she had been willing, that the Whitmores were fools if they thought the child was theirs. Word of his bragging reached the plantation within days. When Richard heard about it, his reaction was swift and violent. He confronted Sarah, demanding to know if it was true. Sarah's journal entry from that confrontation is one of the most harrowing in the collection. She wrote, "Master grabbed my arms and shook me. He screamed at me. He called me things I cannot write even here. He said I had betrayed him and mistress. He said I had ruined everything. I told him the truth. I told him the overseer forced himself on me before the arrangement began. I told him I had no choice, that I never had any choice in any of this. He struck me across the face. It was the first time he had hit me. Then he left the room and I heard him shouting for the overseer. I knew what was coming. I knew someone was going to be punished for my body being used by someone other than him. Richard fired Thomas Green that same day and banned him from the property. But the damage was done. The story had spread through Natchez society. People were talking. The Whitmore's reputation was at stake. Margaret's response was to become even more possessive of Sarah, insisting that the child was Richard's regardless of what the overseer claimed. She told anyone who would listen that Sarah was devoted to their family, that she would never have been with anyone else willingly, that the overseer was lying to protect himself from being fired for incompetence. But privately, Margaret's letters reveal her doubt. She wrote to her sister, "I don't know what to believe anymore. Richard assures me the child is his, but I see the uncertainty in his eyes. Sarah swears the overseer forced himself on her, and I want to believe her, but what if she is lying? What if this entire time she has been deceiving us, playing us against each other, laughing at our foolishness? The thought makes me sick. But worse than the thought of her deception is the realization that even if she has been deceiving us, we deserve it. We have done terrible things to her. Things I can barely admit to myself." October brought new complications. Sarah went into premature labor. The baby, a girl, was born 6 weeks early. She was small, fragile, and according to the doctor's notes that were discovered with the letters, she had features that could have belonged to any of the 3 men who might have been her father. The ambiguity was almost poetic in its cruelty. No one would ever know for certain whose child she was, which meant everyone could believe what they wanted to believe. Margaret insisted the baby was Richard's. Richard said nothing. Sarah, according to Ruth's account, looked at the baby once and then turned her face to the wall. Margaret named the baby Rose. She had Sarah moved to a room adjacent to her own so she could supervise the baby's care. She hired a wet nurse from among the enslaved women because Sarah's milk hadn't come in properly due to stress and malnutrition. She began dressing Rose in fine clothes, showing her to visitors, referring to her as a special child under her protection. The visitors understood what this meant. A mixed-race child being raised in the main house was not unheard of, but it was always complicated, always a source of gossip and judgment. Margaret seemed not to care. She had what she wanted. A child to dote on, a living symbol of her connection to Sarah, a project that justified everything that had come before. Sarah's journal entries from October are brief and often incoherent. She wrote, "I cannot feel anything. I look at the baby and I know I should feel something, but there is nothing inside me. Mistress takes her away for hours at a time. When she brings her back, she tells me what a good mother I am, but I am not a mother. I am a body that produced another body. That is all I am. That is all I have ever been." In another entry, she wrote, "I think about running. I think about taking Rose and disappearing into the night. But I know I wouldn't make it 10 miles. And even if I did, what kind of life could I give her? We would be hunted. Caught. Punished. Rose would be taken from me anyway, and I would likely be killed. So I stay. I endure. I wait for whatever comes next." What came next was the final collapse. In early November, Richard received a letter from his brother in New Orleans. The brother, concerned about the rumors circulating about the Whitmore household, urged Richard to resolve the situation before it destroyed his reputation and his business interests. He suggested selling Sarah quietly to a plantation in another state, keeping Rose in the house if Margaret insisted, but removing the source of the scandal. Richard showed the letter to Margaret. Her reaction was explosive. She refused to consider selling Sarah. She insisted that Sarah was essential to Rose's care, that separating them would be cruel, that they had made promises to Sarah that they intended to keep. Richard argued that they had no choice, that their standing in society was at risk, that they had to think practically. The argument lasted for days, according to household accounts. Servants heard shouting, heard things breaking, heard Margaret weeping and Richard's voice rising in frustration. On November 18, 1850, Sarah Collins wrote her final journal entry. It reads, "I know what is coming. I can feel it the way you feel a storm before it arrives. They are going to separate me from Rose. Or they are going to sell me. Or they are going to find some other way to solve the problem I have become. I thought I could survive anything. I thought I had already lost everything that could be taken. But I was wrong. There is always more to lose. Always more ways to be destroyed. I don't know what will happen to Rose. I hope Mistress keeps her promise to care for her. I hope my daughter has a better life than I have had. But I don't believe in hope anymore. Hope is a luxury for people who have choices. I have none. I am at the mercy of people who have no mercy. This will be my last entry. Whatever comes next, I won't be able to write about it. I won't survive it as myself. Whatever I become after this, it won't be Sarah Collins anymore." That was the last anyone heard from Sarah in her own words. What happened in the following days is pieced together from fragments. Ruth's notes indicate that Sarah was confined to her room on November 20th. Margaret had ordered her locked in after Sarah had attempted to leave the plantation with Rose. The attempt had been desperate, poorly planned, doomed to fail. She had been caught before she reached the property line. Richard's letter to his brother, dated November 22, mentions that they had resolved the situation and that Sarah would be transferred to another household. He doesn't specify where or when. He simply writes, "It is done. Margaret is inconsolable, but she will recover. Rose will remain with us. Sarah is gone. We will not speak of her again." But Sarah wasn't sold to another household. No sale records exist. No transfer documents. No bill of sale. Official plantation records show Sarah Collins' name through November of 1850, and then nothing. She simply vanishes from all documentation. For over 170 years, historians assumed she had escaped or died attempting to escape. But the letters suggest something else. In a final, undated letter found at the bottom of the collection, Margaret writes to her sister. The letter is frantic, barely legible. She writes, "We have done something terrible. I cannot undo it. Richard says we had no choice. He says she would have exposed us, destroyed us, taken Rose from us. He says what we did was necessary. But I see her face every time I close my eyes. I hear her voice. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked at us with those eyes that always saw too much, and she said, 'You were always going to kill me. You just needed to find the right excuse.' And then it was done, and Richard took care of the rest, and now she is gone, and we tell everyone she ran away, and no one questions it because who cares about a missing slave girl? Who will come looking for her? No one. Just like she said. We can do anything to people like her, and the world looks away." The letter ends there. Margaret never sent it. She kept it hidden with the others, evidence of what she and Richard had done. Evidence that Sarah Collins had not escaped. She had been murdered. By the two people who claimed to love her. By the two people who had destroyed her slowly over 11 months and then finished the job when she became too inconvenient to keep alive. Rose was raised in the Whitmore household. Records show she lived there until she was 18, at which point she was married to a free black man and given a small dowry. She had 3 children. Her descendants still live in Mississippi. They carry Sarah's blood, but until these letters were discovered, they never knew Sarah's story. They never knew how their ancestor came into being or what was sacrificed for her existence. The Whitmore plantation was sold in 1867, after the Civil War ended slavery. Richard died in 1869. Margaret lived until 1881. In her final years, according to letters from family members, she suffered from what they called melancholy and delusions. She spoke about a woman who visited her at night, a woman with Sarah's face, a woman who stood at the foot of her bed and watched her without speaking. The family attributed this to the deterioration of her mind. But Margaret insisted the visits were real. In a letter to her daughter, written 6 months before her death, she wrote, "She comes every night now. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. I know what she wants. She wants me to admit what we did. She wants me to confess. But I am too much of a coward even now, even at the end of my life, even knowing I will soon face judgment from a higher power than any human court. I cannot say the words out loud. I can only write them here, where no one will see them until after I am gone. We killed her. We murdered Sarah Collins and buried her somewhere on the property where no one would find her. We told everyone she had run away. And then we went on living. We raised her daughter. We attended church. We were respectable people. And Sarah stayed in the ground, silenced forever, while we pretended we had done nothing wrong." The letters were kept by Margaret's daughter, passed down through generations, hidden away in attics and storage boxes, never read, never shared, until they ended up in that estate sale in Charleston in 2023. When Dr. Hart brought these letters to the attention of authorities, a search was conducted of the former Whitmore plantation property, now divided into several residential lots. In June of 2024, remains were discovered beneath what had been the plantation's kitchen garden. Forensic analysis confirmed the remains were those of a young black woman, approximately 23 years old at the time of death, who died in the mid-19th century. The cause of death could not be definitively determined due to the condition of the remains, but evidence suggested trauma to the skull. DNA analysis is ongoing, with attempts being made to compare the remains to living descendants of Rose to confirm identity. But even without final confirmation, the historical evidence is clear. Sarah Collins was murdered by Richard and Margaret Whitmore in November of 1850. This story raises questions that extend far beyond one woman's death in 1850. It forces us to confront the reality that slavery wasn't just about labor and economics. It was about total control over human beings, control that extended into the most intimate aspects of life. Control over bodies, over sexuality, over reproduction, over the ability to form bonds and relationships. The Whitmores believed they loved Sarah. They wrote about her with affection. They gave her gifts. They made promises. But love cannot exist in the context of ownership. What they felt was possession, obsession, entitlement. They believed they had the right to Sarah's body, her time, her emotional labor, her child. And when she threatened that sense of ownership by trying to escape with Rose, they believed they had the right to end her life. The legal framework of slavery made this possible. Every aspect of what happened to Sarah was permissible under the laws of Mississippi in 1850. Her enslavement was legal. Her sexual exploitation was legal. The taking of her child was legal. Even her murder, while technically a crime, was functionally unpunishable because enslaved people could not testify against white people in court, and no white person would have testified against the Whitmores. The system itself was designed to allow this kind of atrocity. The system itself was designed to protect people like Richard and Margaret while offering no protection whatsoever to people like Sarah. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the way the Whitmores justified their actions to themselves. They weren't cruel overseers or brutal slave traders. They were educated, cultured, religious people who saw themselves as benevolent masters. Margaret genuinely believed she was offering Sarah a better life by bringing her into the household, by showing her special attention, by elevating her above the other enslaved people. Richard convinced himself that the arrangement was somehow consensual, that Sarah had agency in the situation, that her compliance meant she was willing. They both engaged in elaborate self-deception, rewriting the reality of what they were doing to fit a narrative they could live with. But Sarah's journal cuts through that deception. She understood exactly what was happening. She knew she was being destroyed. She knew that every kindness was also a violation, every gift a chain, every expression of affection an assertion of ownership. The child, Rose, adds another layer of tragedy to this story. She was raised by the people who murdered her mother. She was given opportunities, educated, eventually freed and married. By the standards of the time, she had a relatively good life for someone born into slavery. But she grew up never knowing the truth about her mother. She was told Sarah had run away, abandoned her, chosen freedom over her child. The Whitmores allowed Rose to believe her mother didn't love her enough to stay. That lie was another form of violence, another way of controlling the narrative, another way of erasing Sarah even after death. Rose died in 1903 without ever knowing what happened to her mother. Her descendants lived for over a century without knowing. The truth was buried with Sarah's body, hidden in letters that were never sent, preserved by guilt but never confessed. Since the discovery of these letters and the subsequent finding of Sarah's remains, there has been significant debate about how to memorialize her story. Some argue for a formal burial with full honors, a recognition of the injustice done to her. Others argue that her remains should be studied further, that there is more to learn from forensic analysis, that her body can still provide evidence about the conditions of slavery and the violence enslaved people endured. Sarah's descendants, including Rose's great-great-grandchildren who are still living, have mixed feelings. Some want their ancestor finally laid to rest with dignity. Others want her story told as widely as possible, want her to serve as a symbol of the countless enslaved women who suffered similar fates but whose stories were never documented, never discovered, never told. What we do know is that Sarah Collins was not unique. The dynamics that destroyed her were common throughout the slaveholding South. Enslaved women were routinely subjected to sexual exploitation by masters, mistresses, overseers, and other white men in positions of power. Children born from these violations were enslaved from birth, their parentage often deliberately obscured, their existence a constant reminder of the sexual violence inherent in the system. Many enslaved women were caught in similar triangulations, desired by multiple members of a white household, forced to navigate impossible situations with no power and no protection. Most of these women's stories were never written down. They suffered and died without leaving any record beyond perhaps a name in a slave inventory or a line in a plantation ledger. Sarah is unusual only because she was literate, because she kept a journal, because the people who killed her were foolish enough to write about what they had done and narcissistic enough to preserve those writings. Her story survives not because she was uniquely victimized but because the evidence survived. The letters have been donated to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, where they are now part of the permanent collection. Sarah's journal has been transcribed and published, though with careful contextual framing to ensure readers understand the conditions under which it was written. Historians have used the documents to write papers about the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, about the psychology of slaveholders, about the ways power corrupts intimate relationships. Graduate students study the case in courses on slavery, on women's history, on the history of sexuality. Sarah has become, posthumously and against her will, an educational tool. Her suffering is now data. Her words are now primary sources. Her body is now forensic evidence. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this, about the way academia and museums have taken possession of Sarah's story just as Richard and Margaret took possession of her body. But there is also value in ensuring that what happened to her is not forgotten, that future generations understand the full scope of slavery's violence, that her silencing is finally, belatedly, partially reversed. In 2024, a memorial was erected on the site where Sarah's remains were found. It is a simple stone marker with her name, her approximate birth and death years, and a quote from her journal. The quote chosen by her descendants reads, "I have learned to separate my mind from my body." It is a devastating choice, a recognition that Sarah's survival strategy was dissociation, that the only way she could endure what was being done to her was to fragment herself. But it is also a testimony to her strength, to her will to survive even when survival seemed impossible. The memorial has become a site of pilgrimage for people interested in slavery history, for descendants of enslaved people seeking connection to their ancestors' experiences, for activists working on issues of racial justice and women's rights. People leave flowers. They leave notes. They stand in silence, bearing witness to suffering they cannot fully comprehend but feel compelled to acknowledge. The Whitmore family descendants who still live in the area have had varied responses to the revelations. Some have issued public apologies, acknowledging their ancestors' crimes and expressing remorse. Others have denied the validity of the letters, claiming they could be forgeries or that the evidence is inconclusive. A few have argued that judging 19th-century people by 21st-century standards is unfair, that Richard and Margaret were products of their time, that they cannot be held responsible for participating in a system they were born into. This argument has been roundly rejected by historians and descendants alike. The existence of abolitionists in the 1850s, the existence of enslaved people's own testimonies about the injustice of slavery, the existence of Sarah's journal describing her own suffering, all of these prove that people at the time understood slavery was wrong. They simply chose to participate in it anyway because it benefited them. Richard and Margaret understood what they were doing. Their own letters admit as much. They felt guilt. They felt shame. They knew they were doing something terrible. They did it anyway. And then they killed Sarah to cover it up. The question of how to reckon with this history remains unresolved. Should the Whitmore descendants face any kind of accountability? What would accountability even look like 175 years after the crime? Should they pay reparations to Sarah's descendants? Should they fund scholarships or memorials in her name? Should they participate in public truth-telling processes? These are questions being debated in communities across the American South as more stories like Sarah's come to light. The discovery of her letters is part of a larger wave of historical reckoning, as archives are searched, as old properties are excavated, as DNA testing connects living people to ancestors whose names and stories had been lost. The dead are speaking. The buried are being unearthed. The silenced are finding their voices through the documents they left behind and through the descendants who refused to let their stories remain hidden. Sarah Collins was 23 years old when she died. She had been enslaved her entire life. She had been sold 3 times. She had been sexually assaulted by multiple men. She had been psychologically tortured by 2 people who claimed to love her. She had given birth to a child who was immediately claimed by her oppressors. She had tried to escape and been caught. And then she had been murdered and buried in an unmarked grave, her death covered up, her existence erased from official records. For 173 years, no one knew where she was. No one mourned her. No one sought justice for her. She was forgotten, as the Whitmores intended. But she is not forgotten anymore. Her words survive. Her story survives. Her descendants survive. And through them, Sarah Collins continues to testify about the violence of slavery, about the impossibility of consent under conditions of total power imbalance, about the ways obsession and ownership intertwine in systems of oppression. This documentary exists because Sarah wrote down her truth. She wrote it knowing she might not survive. She wrote it with no guarantee that anyone would ever read it. She hid her journal in a Bible, perhaps hoping that something sacred might protect something profane, that her testimony might somehow outlast her body. And it did. Against all odds, her word survived when she did not. They survived the people who killed her. They survived 175 years of silence. They survived attempts to hide and forget and erase. And now they are here, evidence of a life that mattered, of suffering that deserves to be acknowledged, of an injustice that demands recognition even though it can never be rectified. Sarah Collins cannot be brought back. The years stolen from her cannot be returned. The trauma inflicted on her cannot be undone. Rose grew up and died never knowing the truth about her mother. The Whitmores lived long lives and died in their beds, never facing earthly consequences for what they did. In conventional terms, they got away with it. But history has a longer memory than any individual lifetime. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when it has been deliberately buried. Sarah's grave was found. Her words were read. Her story was told. And now, finally, belatedly, inadequately, we bear witness. We say her name. We acknowledge that she lived, that she suffered, that she resisted in the only ways available to her, that she loved her child even though that child was taken from her, that she tried to escape even though escape was impossible, that she wrote down her truth even though she had no reason to believe anyone would ever read it. We acknowledge all of this, and in acknowledging it, we refuse to let her killers have the final word. The story of Sarah Collins is a story about power and its abuses. It is a story about how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when systems of oppression give them permission. It is a story about how love and violence can be twisted together when one person owns another. It is a story about survival and resistance under impossible conditions. It is a story about a woman who saw clearly, who understood her situation, who articulated the truth about what was being done to her even though that truth could not save her. And it is a story about the long reach of injustice, the way past crimes cast shadows into the present, the way buried bodies eventually demand to be found, the way silenced voices eventually find ways to speak. If you found this story important, if you believe Sarah's testimony matters, if you think these histories need to be told and remembered and reckoned with, then I ask you to share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more deep investigations into forgotten histories and untold stories. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your reactions, your own family histories if you feel comfortable doing so. Click the like button to help this video reach more people. The algorithm favors engagement, and engagement means more people will hear Sarah's story. More people will learn about the realities of slavery beyond what textbooks taught them. More people will understand that history is not abstract, that it is made up of individual lives, individual sufferings, individual acts of resistance and survival. Sarah Collins deserves to be remembered. She deserves to have her truth told. And you can help ensure that happens by sharing her story with others. Thank you for watching. Thank you for bearing witness. And thank you for helping to keep Sarah's memory alive.